So while you guys are finishing up that, just a quick reminder that the college does still host classes until noon on Wednesday. So we will have class Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week. So be prepared to come to that. If not, you will be marked absent and you'll probably want to watch those YouTube videos to recap what you missed, since there's a quiz over the stuff later on. Also, you guys have a discussion post due Friday this week, the answer for which you will be learning today. And you should also be figuring out what you want to do for your gallery report. Technically, you should have probably already figured out what you wanted to do for your gallery report, whether it was virtual or in person. And now you make time, you should be making time to look at the stuff, and whether it be in person or virtual. So are there any questions about how to get your gallery report started, or the requirements for your gallery report? Remember, always need an introduction and a conclusion. You guys need to go over what should be in a basic introduction, because that's all I'm wanting is a basic introduction. You should always have an opening sentence, your thesis statement and topic sentences, and then a transition sentence. That's super basic. That's all you need. Oh, and little side note, every time I teach class and we get to the gallery report, there's always one person that writes down the actual address of the place. I don't need the address. You can give me the name of the place, that's good, that's sufficient. I don't need to know the actual like street address of it. But the name is sufficient enough. Okay, let's see. I think everyone who's coming has come. Let's see what you guys have got down. So we have a good amount. There's still some people that haven't finished, I can tell. I think it comes to mind. Architecture and mythology, yep. Trojan War. Parthenon. These are all really good answers. Some of you guys got Greece and Rome mixed up though, I can tell. That's okay, we'll work on that in the next few days. It's a common mistake because at one point Rome does conquer and control Greece. Beaches, yeah. My night class, the only thing that they wrote, like when they did this, my night class, by the way, is a bunch of like older adults, and almost every single one of them answered vacation. Ocean, seas, beaches, villas, and vacations. None of them talked about mythology or art or anything. Mamma Mia, yeah. That's in Italy, which is separate from Greece, two different countries, but similar in landscape, I suppose. They're both Mediterranean. Good answers, guys. Olives, yeah. I've recently learned that people don't like eating olives. I love eating olives. I've recently discovered that that's like a weird thing that most people don't like, and I didn't realize that. My mother used to sit them out when I was a child for like parties and stuff, and I would just eat them. Okay, so that takes us to the topic today and kind of gets us thinking about different things for the topic. It also gives me a basic understanding of what you guys probably already know as far as what Greece is and the things that came from ancient Greece. But because it's only fair, the things that I think of when I think of Greece, various city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. I saw someone else put something similar to that as well. Idealized human figures, that has to do with the art styles that they have. They always show like perfect humans, and we'll talk about that more today. Columns, so like an architectural feature, a bunch of you guys mentioned that too. And the Olympics, since they were the first ones to do that. Of course, their Olympics were quite a bit different from ours. Okay, so some special key terms that you might want to jot down before we get into talking about certain specific things. The main thing you guys are wanting to know today are the different periods of art, but before we do that, let's go over some key terms. So a crater is a large vessel with handles, and we're talking really, really big, huge. And in that vessel usually would be a mixture of wine and water, and it would be functioning at large parties and gatherings. Basically a giant punch bowl, like a really, really, really big punch bowl. A kore is an archaic female figure who is always depicted as youthful. We will learn about archaic art in a moment. The kouros is the male version of that. And contrapposto literally means counterpoised. So yesterday when we learned about the Egyptians and their statues, we learned that they were extremely stiff and not really anatomically correct, because when you take a step forward, like things shift. The Greeks figure out that that happens when you put all your weight on one leg, your hip goes up, the other one goes down, your arms change as well. They figured that out, and they termed that as contrapposto, which means counterpoised. So you're not poised, you're counterpoised. You're not stiff and poised, you're moving. Your body has some movement. And we'll talk about that more as well. Because Greek art does not start off like that. So, common misconceptions when it comes to Greek art and Greek history. The Greeks had already been making art for a very, very long time prior to what we're talking about today. Most people, when they think of Greek art, they're only thinking of classical Greek art. We'll learn what that is in a second. But the Greeks had been making art for a very, 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 very long time, and that era was known as the Dark Ages of Greek art. It's not like one day the Greeks just woke up and said, okay, guys, it's time to make art today. They'd already been making it for a long time. It's just unfortunate that it's a common misconception that people only associate specific art styles with the Greeks. Unlike the Egyptians, Greek art does change frequently throughout time, and we will be learning about those changes today. We are going to be covering Greek art following 900 BCE, but like I said, they were making art prior to that. We just aren't getting to touch on that in this class. If you want to learn more about that, you can take Survey 1 in the spring, which we will spend a long, long time talking about Greek art prior to 900 BCE. The first period of art that we are going to touch on today very briefly is the geometric period. The geometric period occurs roughly between 900 BCE and 700 BCE, but once again, I use the word roughly. Same deal. It's not like one day they were like, okay, it's 700 BCE, guys, we got to change our art style starting now. It is no longer geometric. If you're familiar with like trends of clothing and things like that, you'll know that they're interchangeable. Some people stick with it longer than others. Same with iPhones. It's not like because the new iPhone comes out, everyone trades in their old one to get the new one. Some people stick around with the old one. After the geometric period takes us into the archaic period. The archaic period occurs roughly, once again, roughly, from 700 BCE to 480 BCE. That's where those terms Kore and Koros originate. The archaic period of art is very heavily influenced with Egypt. It's around this time period that Greece has begun trading heavily with Egypt as far as food and wares. So the statues and architecture and art styles are very, very similar to Egyptians. And then the classical period, which is the one that most people think of when they think of ancient Greece, occurs roughly from 510 BCE to 320 BCE. And of course, there's an early classical, a high classical, and a late classical, but we're just going to talk about classical as a broad term today. And that takes us to the last period of Greek art, which is the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period occurs roughly between 323 BCE and 31 BCE. This is the time period in which ancient Rome starts to conquer Greece, which in turn affects their art styles. And it is named literally after the Greeks. Hellen means Greek, istic means kinda, so it literally translates to kinda Greek, because at this point Rome has conquered and it's only kinda Greek now. And of course, we're going to elaborate on all of these as we go along. Remember, your discussion post asks for the 3 main time periods of Greek art. Those time periods would be archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. Geometric, unfortunately, still falls under the Dark Ages period of Greek art, but I didn't want to leave them all out because the geometric period is kind of interesting. It also sets the tone for what we're going to be discussing today. So the 3 that you need to care about most are the archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. So a brief timeline to give you an idea of what we're covering. Unfortunately, we don't get to talk about the Minoans or the Mycenaeans. The Minoan people are named after the Minotaur. There's like a labyrinth on the island. It's pretty cool. Once again, if you take Survey 1, you'll get to learn all about it and all about the art that came from them. We are going to start with the geometric period, which is mostly known for their pottery, and move into archaic, classical, and then end off with Hellenistic today. Starting with the geometric period, I'm guessing you can probably tell why it's called the geometric period just looking at that first image there. That is some early pottery from that period of time made of terracotta. Almost all of the art styles from the archaic and geometric period are going to involve terracotta clay. So sun-dried clay. They would not use potter's wheels. They would use the coil method in which you hand mold things. So, like I said, just looking at this, you can probably guess why it's called geometric, but does anyone want to take a shot? Why might this be known as the geometric period? Yeah, pretty much everything is using like a basic geometric form or shape. There's also a lot of repetitive patterns of those geometric shapes, which you can see in the lower band there. And that's literally the reason why it's called the geometric period. The geometric period marks the tail end of the dark ages of Greece, and Greece becomes a civilization around this time period. The name comes from the geometric shapes and patterns that are seen on the artifacts, such as circles and squares and triangles. The patterns are very repetitive, and geometric art is most commonly seen on vessels or pottery, such as craters. Now we can refresh our memory as to what a crater is. Yeah. I don't care. You don't even have to raise your hand in this class. There's not that many of you. But back. Yeah. A large vessel with hands usually used to mix wine and water. So by large, I mean like big. We're talking about an oversized punch bowl here. Once again, usually used at parties or funerals, because for these people, funerals are parties. In case you're not familiar with the Greeks, they love to party and they're really good at it. That's going to be a common theme that's going to keep popping up today. And here is what our crater looks like, at least the one we're going to be talking about today. This is known as the Diplon crater, sometimes called the terracotta crater, but it's referred to as the Diplon crater because it was found in the Diplon cemetery. So I just mentioned sometimes they used them at funerals to party. This also functioned as a grave marker for the person that it was like sitting on top of at the burial site. So this is really, really big. It doesn't look really big in that image, but it's several feet tall and a few feet wide. So it's huge. And once again, you can tell it falls under the geometric period, number one, because it's made of terracotta. Number two, because of the Greek key, which is what that little design is on the top band there, which is a geometric design that pops up during this period. And also the geometric shapes that are used in the upper and lower bands here. And of course, these are bands, that's what I'm referring to. It does have some small handles on each side. Of course, this one would have not been moved. It was literally a grave marker. And we can learn a little bit about the guy that it marked the grave for by reading the panels. So here you might be wondering what's going on. There's like a table, and then there's a dude laying on the table. Why do you think he's laying on the table? Because he's dead. Yeah, that's the dead guy. And that's not just a table, it's his funerary pyre. They cremate their people at this time in Greece. So he is going to be burned. And that's the pyre in which he's going to burn upon. And then over top of him, you'll notice a checker pattern. That is the cloth that would have been laid over top of him. They've removed it for the purpose of displaying him and his body so that you know what's going on. But of course, when he was burned in real life, that would have been covering him. It's just a piece of fabric. And then on each side are women who mark the attenders and criers for and mourners for the funeral. And we can tell they're women because you can't really tell in this image, but if you actually look at the textbook in the image, I think that textbook has a big enough image, but you can tell they're women because they have little bulges on the sides of their triangle torsos, which represent breasts. It's just a little bulge underneath their armpit is basically what it looks like right there. And their arms are raised in like mourning prayer exaggeration format there. So we can tell that is his funeral going on above, and then below we can learn a little bit about his family. So below the scene, you'll notice there are horses and a chariot. In fact, there's several of them, they repeat, as well as men carrying shields. So that tells us that either this man was a military figure or his family is known for some sort of military prominence. Most likely it is the second, because these shields predate this crater by quite a bit, quite a few hundred years. So most likely his family was really well known for some sort of military accomplishment that they'd achieved in the past. That tells us about him. Something other than a crater to look at from the geometric period, we have a bronze statue. Remember, this is like early Bronze Age art here. And it is a bronze man and a centaur. Centaurs and men will pop up a couple of times today. It's a pretty popular story for Greeks and Greek mythology. The Greeks themselves feel like they are superior to everyone around them. That happens and continues on for quite a period of time. And anyone that is not Greek is less than. So right here we see a Greek and something that is not Greek, that is being portrayed as less than. We also see a little bit of hierarchic scale to help show that theme. Normally, a horseman would probably not be smaller than an actual man. Horses are usually bigger than people, right? Just a little bit bigger. But this centaur is being depicted smaller than the Greek man here because he's different. He's less than. Anyone that's not Greek is less. So this is a story from Greek mythology about the Lapiths, or the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, fighting the centaurs. Supposedly in ancient Greece, there were centaurs, and the Greek people known as Lapiths lived together. And the Greek Lapiths ended up having to drive the centaurs away because they were beasts and they tried to rape their women. So that was just a very brief outline of that story. And right here, we actually see these two in the middle of that fight. We can tell that because the side of the centaur has been pierced with a spearhead. Of course, the whole theme of this is that it falls under geometric art once again because of the geometric shapes that were used, the very basic shapes used to create it. And that takes us into our next period of art. After the geometric period follows the archaic period. The archaic period shows us a shift from using basic geometric designs and shapes to a more realistic depiction of human beings, but not super realistic. We aren't quite there yet. We're working towards that realism. The archaic period is very influenced by Egypt, like I mentioned earlier. We'll definitely see that in the statues in a second. That's because they started trading with Egypt at this point. And of course, when you're trading, you also see art and artifacts coming back and forth. Other things that pop out from the archaic period are black figure terracotta pottery. That just means that the figures are generally in black. Following this period will be red figure pottery, in which the figures are red. There's not much difference there. And we also see more intricate pattern displays with archaic art. You still see your Greek key though. Okay, some key features for archaic art that everyone's going to want to know for the discussion post. Once again, shows very heavy influence from Egypt as trade increased. This is where our terms kore and koros come from. The archaic style likes to feature a youthful female figure and male figure. The male figures would normally be nude, which takes me to a little PSA side note. We are in ancient Greece and Rome, so people are naked. The female figures are usually clothed at this point. When we get to classical art, they won't be. And when I say the term youthful, what age are we probably talking about? We aren't talking about like children. That's weird. What age range do you think they're referring to when I say youthful? Like late teens, early 20s. Yeah, like 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, that age range. The Greeks are going to stick with that age range for quite some time. Why? Because that is when human beings' bodies are in their prime, is in late teens, early 20s. The Greeks themselves believe that humans are descended from the gods and goddesses. Therefore, humans are supposed to be depicted as perfect beings like the gods and goddesses. So they choose to show human figures in a very idealized form, which is why during the archaic style period, we see those youthful figures. We also see figures in very stiff, rigid frontal poses. Forward, be clenched to the side. The difference is that the Egyptians put clothing on theirs and the Greeks won't. The other thing that's different is that during the archaic period, they used something called the archaic smile. All of their statues are smiling. The Egyptians did not do that. The Egyptians had a very serious facial expression on all of their statues. They also had really funny hair. I say funny, but it's a hairstyle that was adopted from the Mesopotamians. We noticed it yesterday on the bearded bull's head. That braided curly beard is going to be repurposed onto archaic art. They're going to have a braided curly style hair that won't stick around for classical period. Also, these would have originally been painted. In fact, most Greek art would have originally been painted. Okay, here we have our example of the koros, or the youthful male, made of marble. So you can see what I mean by heavy influence from the Egyptians. You can see it in the rigid pose with fists clenched to the side and one foot stepping forward. Once again, normally when we're stepping forward, our hips are not specifically like even like this, same with our shoulder blades. The main difference, like I said, is the fact that the Greeks chose to portray their figures and the faces are quite a bit different. And here is our kore, or our female youth. This is the Peplos kore. And she would have originally been painted. We'll see what she used to look like painted in a second, but once again, a very stiff, rigid pose. Like I said, the female figures are clothed. She is actually named after the clothing that she's wearing. A peplos is what she's wearing, which is like a loose tunic. And of course, the archaic smile, the braided hairstyle, and normally, well, not normally, but she used to have a hand. That hand held something, and the something that it held told us who she was. Unfortunately, that hand is missing because she was found in the Acropolis at Athens, which was made for Athena. Some people believe that she might have been Athena, but the painting remnants that we have from her peplos depict deer, and Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, which she is most commonly associated with deers. So there is debate on whether this used to be Athena or Artemis. And that's what she used to look like with paint on her. So something big happens after the Archaic period, but like I said, it's not like they all just decided one day, no more Archaic. It was a flow and ebb that was occurring between the art styles, but something big happened. And that big thing was contrapposto. Contrapposto is invented by a man named Polyclitus of Argos, and that marks the beginning of the classical period of Greek art, the period of art that they are most well known for. Polyclitus made it his job, his life's mission, to go around and study human anatomy. By doing so, he would take measurements, mathematical measurements, numbers, ratios, proportions, and study humans as they were going through different poses and see what happened with the skeletal and muscle structures of our bodies when we moved. He kept those in a notebook, and eventually he will publish a book which supposedly gives us the proportions of the perfect male form, which is exactly what that spear bearer is supposed to be there. So that spear bearer was made by Polyclitus. Originally, it would have been made in bronze. Unfortunately, it was melted down, but we do have, luckily, a Roman copy. Once again, you can tell it's a Roman copy because of the lovely little random tree stump attached to his leg and the little accoutrement there. He would have also been originally holding a spear in this arm here, which was draped over his shoulder. So you can see now we have taken a step away from the rigid, stiff poses that the Egyptians taught them during the Archaic period, and they have moved on to that contrapposto. Like I said, he studied a bunch of different models to figure out what he felt were the ideal proportions of the male human, and then published it in a book. That's just a little funny thing. So the Egyptians kept doing their stiff, rigid frontal poses for a very, very long time, but the Greeks have finally evolved. Thank goodness. And once again, that term is contrapposto, or counterpoised. Another example of the dynamic poses that start coming about thanks to the invention of contrapposto and people actually studying human figures and figuring out what happens when we move is the disc obelus. Once again, a Roman copy. And then, of course, towards the end of the classical period, people stop favoring those super muscular buff men and they move on to trying to depict sensuality. Of course, if we're talking about sensuality, we must be talking about Venus. She is the goddess of love and being known as supposedly the most beautiful goddess. It makes sense that they would choose to depict Venus to show sensuality. So the next statue we're going to look at is the Venus de Medici. She's called the Venus de Medici because she was once in the possession of the Medici family during the Renaissance period. And she was carved by a man named Praxiteles. And then after looking at the Venus de Medici, we're going to check out some columns. There are 3 different kinds of columns in Greek architecture because we are going to be moving into architecture since they are kind of known for that, which most of you caught on with at the beginning with the Padlet. But they know there's 3 different columns, and those columns are identifiable based on the capitals. Capitals are located at the very top of a column. We will look at that closer when we get to that image, but there are 3 different kinds of capitals. There's a Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Doric column existed in the Archaic period. The Ionic column was created during the Classical period, and the Corinthian column towards the end of the Classical period. The Doric column, of course, is the most basic one. Ionic is a little bit nicer, and Corinthian is very ornate. So we start off with basic and go to the most extravagant. Here is that Venus de Medici. Of course, she is trying to modestly cover herself there. But once again, because it's only fair, this is supposed to depict the idealized female form according to the Greeks at the time. Can't look at the idealized male form and not look at the idealized female form. We gotta be fair. But once again, you see a depiction of them choosing a person in their 20s or late teens to depict as the idealized form, because that is supposedly when humans are at their peak, at least according to them. We can tell that this is supposed to be Aphrodite or Venus because of Cupid down here. Cupid is supposedly her son. And there's a rumor or a story that goes along with this one that Praxiteles did such a wonderful job at capturing Venus that Venus herself asked, "Did he see me exiting the bath?" As in, did he catch me while I was taking a bath? Is that how he got it so accurate? Of course, it's made up because, yeah, Venus is the goddess, and yeah. But anyways, here are our columns. So before we can talk about a famous building that we're about to talk about, we have to understand a little bit about the architectural features that pop up in Greek art. Of course, here is your Doric column, Ionic and Corinthian. You can tell the difference between them because of the capital. The capital is that little structure that it's at the very top of the column. As far as column structures, columns will have a base. The Doric column does not have a base. The Ionic and Corinthian columns have bases. Then the columns will have fluting. Fluting are those lines that weave in and out. Not all columns have fluting. Some do, some don't. They aren't necessary. And then, of course, your capital. Your Doric column is the most basic. Ionic has those curly cues on each side, and Corinthian has a lot of leafy filigree on the top. And that takes us to the frieze. The frieze is located right here. In a frieze, you will most commonly find small relief engravings and sculptures that tell stories from mythology, or at least with Greek art, they'll tell stories from mythology. And then the Doric column here, instead of a frieze, it is featuring something called a metope. Metopes are just small windows instead of a continuous band. Metopes also feature relief sculptures that tell stories. And then, of course, on top of this frieze band, you will normally find your pediment, which is your triangular bit that helps make up the roof, which also has relief sculptures that tell stories. That takes us to the famous building that's associated with Greek architecture. Before we get to that building, though, we do need to talk about its location. So this is a little cartoon sketch of the Acropolis at Athens. The Acropolis was located at the top of a mountain in Athens, Greece. You would walk up the mountain, and of course, you would encounter several temples on the way up, such as the temple of the Nike Athena, located on this edge, of which there was a statue of a Nike, the one without the wings that we looked at before when we were looking at sculptures, because her head and her wings were broken off. She was located there. And then you would walk through and go up to eventually the really important building here that we're going to get to. You would most likely encounter a lot of stalls and food places trying to sell you things like wine and trinkets. If you were traveling up to the Acropolis and the Parthenon, you were probably going during a festival time. So it would be a very busy area. I'm trying to think of something around here that would be similar. The only thing that I can think of is if you've ever been to like, I don't know, there's nothing really like that here. If you've ever been to a really, really crowded farmer's market with all of the stalls open trying to sell things on your path, that's like that. There would be stalls lining each side of the road, except for our farmer's market is super small in comparison to like a lot of bigger farmer's markets. Anyways, so the, of course, end destination would be your Parthenon located here. The Parthenon has two pediments. Pediments, once again, are the triangular bits. You would walk up to the temple. This temple was dedicated to the goddess Athena, who was the goddess of Athens. That was literally their patron goddess. And then there is the outer temple area, and then there is an inner temple area, which would have housed a very, very, very large statue of Athena. And once a year, they would go and reclose that statue, which caused a big festival to happen. What's left of it today. So when Turkey attempted to invade Greece, Turkey decided to store ammunition and gunpowder in the Parthenon, and it happened to catch fire one night and blew the roof off the place, literally. So that's what's left of it today. Greece is working on trying to restore it as much as possible. There used to be marble sculptures and reliefs surrounding in the metopes as well as in the pediments. There also used to be a really large statue of Athena, like I said. The remnants of the pediment sculptures and metopes are actually located in Great Britain. A lord named Lord Elgin went to Greece after this happened and collected what was left and said, you guys can't take care of your stuff, so we're confiscating it so that we still have it. And they stored it in the British Museum. The Greeks now today want their stuff back. They made a special museum to house it, and the Great Britain won't give it back. So yeah, that's a big like who owns what at this point, and there's a lot of court cases based around it. But originally, those sculptures would have looked like this. This is one of the pediments here, which shows the battle between the gods and the Titans. And then down below, you have the metopes, which once again illustrate that story between the Lapiths and the centaurs. And of course, it used to be painted. You can see in the background, it used to be a ruby red. This is what's left of that one today. And these are really big too. Really, really big. They would have been life-sized human figures when they were whole. This reproduction, by the way, is located in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you want to see what the Parthenon used to look like, go to Nashville. If you want to see what's left of the Parthenon, go to Great Britain, go to London. This is what's left of the other pediment, which shows a story of Athena hanging out with the other gods and goddesses, lounging. And then that's a really blurry picture of what the statue would have looked like, sorry. Of course, we don't have anything of that left. And that takes us to Hellenistic art, our final art for this section, and then we're going to go into Rome, the one you care about most, because this is on your discussion post. This is the last period that you have to write about. So it is literally translates to Greek-like Once again, this is the time period in which Rome starts to conquer ancient Greece. This ends up influencing their art styles. Rome, which you're about to learn about in a second, doesn't care about idealizing anything. They like to show things how they actually are. So they like to be very realistic in their human depictions, but to not idealize their human depictions. If someone has wrinkles, they're going to show them with wrinkles. That ends up influencing to, in turn, also start showing people how they actually look. They also, during the Hellenistic period, like to overly exaggerate things. We're going to see the same thing happen with the Renaissance period and the Baroque period to follow, which we're going to talk about probably on Monday next week. But the Hellenistic period of art is known for being very exaggerated and expressive and having lots of movement and dynamic poses. So this is our last stage of Greek art, once again, approximately 323 to 30 BCE. This shows the decline of Athens as a city-state and the decline of Greece as a separate country itself. They end up being incorporated into the Roman Empire. And one of the quintessential art pieces from the Hellenistic period is the Laocoon group, or Laocoon and his sons. Now in this one, we see Laocoon being depicted as a really, really buff, muscular man, and his sons being depicted as very buff, muscular children. Small children with lots of muscles. That is because they didn't know how else to show that Laocoon was the dad and the sons were his sons. In the actual mythological story, Laocoon's sons are in their 20s and Laocoon is an old man. They didn't know how else to show it. So they chose an interesting way to do it, and it does have a lot of movement and exaggeration in the statue. The facial expressions alone are quite a bit different from classical Greek art. Classical Greek art didn't really show emotions. Here we have a lot of emotions going on. But once again, in the actual story, these guys are in their 20s, and he was an older man. You can kind of see it in the beard, but the rest of him doesn't look like an old man. And there is our serpent. The serpent helps to connect the entire group together as it weaves around them. And this is kind of an example of hierarchic scale in the fact that the father is being depicted larger than the sons, despite the sons actually being in their 20s. But as the story goes, Laocoon saves his sons from the serpent's grasp. Now, my favorite Hellenistic art piece, which is not in your book, but it's my favorite, this is the old woman. And this is one that I feel really captures Hellenistic art. We don't have an idealized form. We are not being sensual or demure at all. We see an old woman as she is on her way back from a Dionysus festival. Does anyone know who the god Dionysus is? Also known as Bacchus. What's he the god of? Anyone online know who Bacchus or Dionysus is the god of? Oh, don't be the only class. Don't be the only class. Someone online. Who's Dionysus or Bacchus? What's he the god of?
The god of wine.
Yeah.
And partying.
Which explains, thank you, I don't know who said that. So he is the god of wine and parties. So that explains why she looks the way she looks. The Festival of Dionysus is a week-long event, by the way, in ancient Greece. And she's just coming back from that week-long event, which explains why she's so disheveled looking. Originally, she would have had arms. She didn't lose those in the festival, but those arms broke off. This is not a Roman copy. This also shows us that at this point, Greece has been conquered. They're no longer making bronze statues. They are making marble statues. Same with this one. This is not a Roman copy. So we have seen that transition from those idealized human forms that the Greeks were so proud of and so well known for. And they're slowly transitioning to a style very similar to what the Romans are doing, which takes us to Rome. So Rome is most well known for their architecture and their engineering feats, but they did produce artworks as well. They made very practical artworks and depictions of people and very realistic depictions of people. They didn't idealize them like the Greeks did, which is why we see that influence in Hellenistic art. And a great example of them choosing not to idealize things and show things how they actually are is in the portrait head of an old man. This is a portrait head of a Roman senator. There's tons of them out there. This is just one example. They made portrait busts of a good chunk of the Roman senators. But if we were alive back then, because this man has been carved to a T with supreme individuality being exhibited, you would probably be able to recognize who he was. And of course, like I said, Rome is most well known for their engineering achievements, which we've already kind of touched on with the architecture section. They use indoor plumbing, they start using roads and paving roads, they invent the arch and the dome, and many, many other things. And here is that portrait head of an old man. He would have had a nose, I promise. But you can tell the wrinkles, the crow's feet. This is not an idealized form at all. But it gives him a lot of individuality and character. This would not have been painted, not like some of the Greek art that we looked at. And of course, like I said, Rome, most linked with architecture. So that's why I said earlier on the Padlet that some of you guys were mixing up Rome with, because I noticed some references to particularly this building, the Colosseum, which is a Flavian amphitheater. Flavian literally just means like theater group. So it's just referring to the fact that it was primarily used for theaters, but it's most well known, of course, for its gladiatorial fights, as well as chariot races, animal baitings, Christian crucifixions and burnings, and a naval battle. Yes, one time they flooded the Colosseum and held a naval battle. Of course, it is made up of a whole bunch of arches and colonnades. And that is that right there. So we have 3 stories of arches. And then there's actually also underground holding areas as well. So there's like a basement area to this. And a good chunk of this was made using concrete. Romans also invented concrete. This is actually a lot larger than people give it credit for. It's about a football field and a half big. And it seated quite a large amount of people. Like 20,000 people, a lot of people. And it was literally done as a public works project as well as the Pantheon. So in Rome, to satiate their people, the Roman empires would occasionally take up engineering marvels such as the Colosseum to keep their people entertained as well as give them jobs to work on it. If you're working and getting paid, you're probably not rioting is the great key term for Rome. They kept their people busy. The Pantheon, do not get it confused with the Parthenon, is another temple, very similar to the Parthenon. In fact, it uses similar architectural designs from the Parthenon. They stole the columns and the pediment feature of the Parthenon temple structure, and they repurposed it for the Pantheon. The Pantheon, though, housed several gods. It wasn't dedicated to just one like the Parthenon was. It was dedicated to quite a few, and there would have been multiple statues of them housed inside. And the Pantheon is the first example of a dome that we see from Rome. It has a single entrance framed by columns like the Parthenon, and then recessed coffers, which we'll talk about in a second. So you can see columns just like the Greeks style of architecture. They stole that idea from the Greeks, as well as a pediment. However, instead of continuing on in a rectangular way, the way the Greeks had their temples laid out, Rome decided that they would add a dome onto the background. Originally, this would have had steps leading up to it, meaning it was above ground. However, due to centuries of paving of roads, it is now technically a little bit underground. The interior of the Pantheon actually makes a perfect sphere with the dome. And you can see right here all of the niches. Each one would have housed a different statue to a Roman god or goddess. Later on, the pagan statues were removed and replaced with Christian statues. And here is an interior little clip of it. These little recessed squares up here are called coffers. This dome is made of concrete. Of course, concrete is very heavy. One of the ways they lightened the concrete was by adding these recessed squares onto it to try and alleviate some of the weight. And then in the center there is an oculus. An oculus is an open air hole at the top of the dome. That's mostly because they didn't know how to close it without it collapsing in back then. It's still open air today, so if you ever go to the Pantheon, there's going to be pigeons inside it nesting, because, yeah, there's a giant hole in the ceiling. These smaller windows also would have housed minor gods and goddesses statues. In the floor of the Pantheon are buried quite a few famous people, including the Renaissance artist Raphael, which we will learn about on Thursday. Yeah. Rome also has several paintings. The Greeks also made paintings. Unfortunately, we don't have too many. If you remember the encaustic painting using beeswax that we looked at of the portrait of the boy, that was from Greece. Because paintings don't hold up as well over time as, let's say, statues, even though some of the statues that we've looked at today didn't really hold up either, we don't have too many examples of painting. However, thanks to today, we do have quite a few examples of Roman paintings. Does anyone know what happened with Pompeii? What happened? Yeah, so a volcano exploded and completely wiped out the city of Pompeii. All of the people ended up dying. Of course, they ended up dying of like smoke inhalation, and the smoke was so hot it burned up their lungs before like the lava reached them. But thanks to all of the ash and lava, everything was perfectly preserved. Like the bodies were perfectly mummified how they died, the plant life was mummified and captured, and the paintings also were perfectly preserved. So we have a great depiction today, thanks to excavations, of what Pompeii would have looked like. In Pompeii, almost all of the homes, or at least the wealthier homes, were decorated in wall murals and frescoes. So what we're going to look at is an image of one of those frescoes found in a villa near Naples here. So you'll notice that it has a very bright red background. Almost all of the Pompeii paintings that have been recovered have that bright red background. So they've termed that red as Pompeii red, since almost all of them have it. And this is what would have adorned the interior home of the wealthier people. This is a scene of that festival of Bacchus. Bacchus was like the patron god of Pompeii. And yeah, I wouldn't look up too many of these because most of them are very graphic, unless you want to. I mean, I'm not going to censor that from you, but this is a very mild one. And that is the end of Greece and Rome. Tomorrow, we're going to start off with Christian and Byzantine art. We've kind of already touched on that with the Church Hagia Sophia. But we're going to talk about how that comes about, because right now today we're ending with Rome still having pagan gods and goddesses. So what makes that change? We're going to start off talking about that tomorrow. Start off talking about how Christianity grows in ancient Rome and spreads throughout Europe, and what art styles come about from that. And then we will move into the Renaissance period. Yay! I want to give you guys the last 15 minutes today to ask any questions about your gallery report or your discussion post if you're confused about that one. Keep in mind that you're not going to